Right, everybody, it's Anthony Brogdon, your main man. I'm your guy and I know it, and there's nothing you can do about it. I'm your guy because, and I don't mean to point at you, but oh well, there is no other source like Strong Inspirations where we get the people who come on the channel like this gentleman, good looking guy too, right? Who come on the channel and give it to you straight, no chasing. He's an expert at what he's going to talk about. Highly thought of in his circles. And he coming on the channel because he wants you to know some of this information. You'll soon hear about it. I'm not playing with you. I'm going to give it to you from now on because I like this. This has really become my mission. I enjoy doing this. So do me a favor, my friends, hit the subscribe button on the channel because I'm giving you new videos, 3, 4 of them a week. Hit the like button on this video. You're going to like it a lot. I guarantee that. Hit the notifications bell for when the videos come up. You get a ding, a shock, a smoke signal, or something. I had one lady send me something. She said, I found a way to when I get the notification, it gives me this song I like to hear. And I know it's you. And I was like, ooh, I'm jamming now. So do that, my friends, and tell somebody about Strong Inspirations. Don't keep it to yourself. Let it flow. Because let me tell you, what happens is, and you all would, I'm sure, concur with me, sometimes we say we don't tell our history right. We let other people tell it. And then they slant it so it don't look so bad from their perspective. That's not what we're doing here. I'm giving it to you, not me, my guest, and we're doing it succinctly and very objectively. If there's another lead, we're doing it that lead. We lean on you, my friends. That's what we're doing. Because here it goes. These are the people who know and they're the experts. So do that, my friends. Like, for example, did you see the video I did with this lady, Dr. Jane Landers? She talks about how there were Black folks in America before 1619, little known thought. Watch that video. I then combined that with another video with a guy by the name of Taylor Sigu, who also covers that same topic, but it's so broad that they, overlap in some of the stories, some they say other things. Watch those videos. Watch the videos where I talk about what happens when the guy talks about in Jamaica, when they had slavery in Jamaica, and where did those slaves, call them maroons, where did they flee to? Because you ain't got but a little bit of island. They went up in the woods. You say, you come up in here, young man, we're going to shoot back. We know this territory. So don't come up here. We done tasted freedom. We'll die for this. Watch that video. How about this one? You know I do it internationally. Did you see the one I did with the guy out of South Africa, but he was born in Lagos, Nigeria? He said, I was in the poorest of the poor country, part of that country. But my dad said something to me over the years that got me to thinking that education is the way out. And now he has a TV show and a star in that part of the world. Did not give up. Watch that video. Check me out. Like I say, hit that subscribe button and all that good stuff. Because I'm going to keep doing this. One more, how about this? Did you see the one I did with the son of the NBA's first Black player? Watch that video. Frederick Douglass's 3-time great-grandson and 2-time great-grandson of Booker T. Washington. Frederick Douglass' great son and, so on and so forth, they married. He's a product of that relationship. Do this, my friends. I'm a filmmaker. I want you to watch my movie. It's called Business in the Black, The Rise of Black Business in America. It's streaming on Amazon. Type Business in the Black and then, type my name in and it'll pop up. Very good film, not just because I did it, but somebody else told me, a bunch of people. And then I wrote this book. Get you a copy of my book. It's called Black Business Book. It's similar to the movie, but more thorough. There is no other book, not just because I have not found another book that covers as much as this in a easy to read format. Easy to read, I don't give you no commentary. I found the fact, I numbered the fact, and I wrote it just in a way that you can get it real easily. And if you want to learn more, you go to the reference section in the back of the book. And I really want you all to have it, and I priced it where it ain't gonna hurt you at all. How about that? Get you a copy of my book. To learn more about me and what I'm doing, go to businessintheblack.net. Now, you know, you all hear me say this all the time, and I'm gonna keep saying it because it's something that I like saying, and that's that word strong. And in my world, strong stands for strength, tenacity, resilience, and a sense of oneness, nobility, and grace. And that is my introduction to my guest today. He's a strong man. Watch out. He's coming on the channel to enlighten your mind, to intoxicate you with this information. Not DUI intoxication, but when you get up from wherever you are watching this, you're going to stagger because of what he has said that you did not know. And now you're going to feel better knowing it. So come on, gentlemen, introduce yourself. Thank you for being on the channel.
Hi, Anthony, and hi to all your viewers. My name is Pablo Sierra. I am a native of the city of Puebla in central Mexico. I am now a resident of Rochester, New York. I've been here for about 10 years. So the stories of the Douglas family run pretty deep. I'm pretty deep up here. And what I'm going to share with you today is a little bit of the research that I've been trying to do on Afro-Mexican history, right? On the history of Black people in Mexico, people of the African diaspora. Often we're taught to not think about these connections that we have.
Right.
Often we're taught to think in terms of division.
Right.
And what I'm trying to do in my studies is to really make us think about commonality. What does it mean that South Carolina and Mexico have very, very similar populations of African descent? What does that mean?
I love it. Okay.
Right?
Hold on, let me stop you there. I don't mean no disrespect in this regard, but I got to ask a couple questions about you so that, you know, my viewers know who you are. Well, where were you born again?
I was born in the city of Puebla. Puebla is it's a city of about 1 million people in central Mexico. It's about 2 hours from Mexico City.
Okay.
But I grew up going back and forth to the States and to Mexico. So I spent some time in Michigan, spent some time in Tennessee, came back to Mexico.
Okay.
Spent a year in Florida, moved to Philadelphia, right? Did my doctoral work out in California. So it's one of these things when people say, where are you from? And you just kind of like,
yeah, okay.
think about it for a little bit.
Now, how did your family get to that city in that part of Mexico? Can you trace it back just a tad for us?
Right, yeah, so my maternal side, my grandmother on my maternal side, she's from Veracruz, from the Gulf Coast of Mexico, which is one of the parts that we're going to talk about. It's one of the places with the greatest concentrations of Black populations. On my father's side, they're more from the north, which had a different kind of economy, more Spanish, more native populations, indigenous populations. And in the middle, which is where most of us, where Mexico City is, right, which is one of the biggest cities in the world, that's where that really fascinating mix takes place. So I like to think that I'm from that middle part that has all sorts of cultural influences. And I just happen to be one of many, many, many Mexicans that live in the States and go back and come back and kind of sharing that experience.
Now, when we talk about that, did you grow up in a part of town where the Black people lived on one side and the non-Blacks lived on the other side? Or did you know Black people growing up, that kind of thing?
Oh, so that's a great question. So I think when I was very little, I lived in a mixed neighborhood in Tennessee. I had Black neighbors, I had white neighbors. That wasn't a thing, but I was very, very little. I don't remember too much about that. when I go back to Mexico, what's really, really challenging about doing this work is there's for a long time been the idea that there are no Black people in Mexico.
Right, I agree. Yeah.
Right?
Right.
So I mean, very recently in 2020, we had a federal census that says, no, in fact, there's 2.5 million people of African descent in Mexico. It's a large population, but it's very regional, right? So in the part where I lived, in the city of Puebla, it's a very, very, very small population, astronomically small, right? But if you go to a neighboring state, if you go to Oaxaca, if you go to Veracruz, and you go into specific parts of the countryside, that's where you see the Black towns, and they're known as los pueblos negros, right? So you have to have that deep, deep knowledge of that particular town to have access to those kinds of experiences.
I got you.
It's changing now. It's changing now, but for a long time it's been like that.
Did you? So you didn't know Black people growing up then?
Well, this is one of these interesting
Other
things.
than coming to America, not in Mexico.
Well, no. So what's interesting is that in Mexico, I have Black relatives, but they had never thought of themselves as Black.
Hold on. Let me stop you. You got Black relatives in your family.
Yeah, on my maternal side. Yeah.
Okay. Let me ask you this: when you say Black, do they have straight hair, or they have nappy hair, like afros and that kind of thing?
Afro hair. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. And so the issue is in Mexico, there's two things. There's a visual aspect of it, which is like, well, you don't look right. Like,
yeah.
And the families, I should say, are very, very, very mixed. You can have a very dark-skinned person with a blonde person in the same family, siblings, same mom, same dad. And that's the spectrum, right? That's the color spectrum that we have in these families, because the mixture has been so intense for about 5 centuries now.
Oh, really? Okay. So growing up, did you know any Black history?
Yes, but I knew the Black history of the United States. So this is one of the interesting things. So when I was young, my parents would get me books, they'd go to the library, whatever. And I remember distinctly reading about Jesse Owens. And I was fascinated by, I'm in 4th grade and I'm fascinated by Jesse Owens. And so I'm starting to get into that history without realizing that Mexico has its own Black history, right? So a lot of us, I think a lot of Mexicans come to Black history by reading the Black history of the United States. And then we start to think like, oh, wait, didn't something like this happen in Veracruz or in Oaxaca? And
oh, really?
Right. So it's I guess from a personal standpoint, but also from academia, there's a lot of thinking about the African-American experience, the civil rights movement, and then reflecting back on that and thinking, wait a minute, something like that happened in the 50s, something like that happened in 1910, something like that happened in 1640, right? So we're always reading US Black history very closely to make sense of our own colonial history.
Okay, let me ask you this. There's always some people on the top that say some people are not. Who is on the top and who is not in Mexico, in your town?
So traditionally, it's been populations of Spanish descent, right? So you've got the history of the conquistadors that we can talk about. And then during the colonial period, there's this idea that there's a caste system, right? So Spaniards born in Spain are at the very top. That's in the old colonial period. Once you get independence, that changes a little bit, but still it's mostly those very privileged, powerful white families get control and amass power. So after a while, you might have slightly darker skinned people start to occupy positions of authority, but it's really well into the national period that you get these really, really important, powerful Black figures. So for instance, one of them, Vicente Guerrero, right? Vicente Guerrero is one of our first presidents in Mexico. He's Black. He's a Black president, and he's also, not coincidentally, the president that abolishes slavery, 1829, right? So this is kind of a manifestation of people saying, okay, colonial rule has been really bad for us. Who emerges, who rises to the top? A Black military general. But before him, there's other people, right? There's Jose Maria Morelos, who's one of our founding fathers. And if we keep going back to the colonial past, we start to see more and more prominent families, Black families, some of them more light-skinned, admittedly, some not so much, but they're there, right? They're merchants, they're book printers, they're artists. And that's the history that we're trying to recover now. That's what we're trying to piece together.
I love it. Yet, let's go back to how did Black people get to Mexico?
Right. So Mexico was conquered by people from Spain and Portugal, right? So we call that the Spanish conquest. And they come through and they immediately bring a lot of disease. It starts to wipe out the indigenous population, right? So Mexico has 90% depopulation, right? Which is just horrific to think about. So what happens? The Spaniards turn to the enslavement of Africans. Why? Because that's been happening in Europe for quite some time already. So they just think, okay, we've been doing that in the Caribbean, we can move that model into Mexico as well. After a while, they start to realize that's kind of complicated. We're going to go directly to Congo and Angola, and we're going to send Portuguese slave traders over there, and they will bring enslaved Africans, especially Central Africans, to the port of Veracruz. So Veracruz is like that main port on the Gulf Coast. So we think that it's around 150 to 200,000 enslaved Africans are brought to Mexico during the colonial period. So
okay, let me stop you there. They're brought there to do what?
To work in domestic service, to work in the silver mines, although after a while that changes, eventually to work on sugarcane plantations, right? But the truth is, Anthony, that when you look at colonial records, you see enslaved people everywhere. You see them working on ranches. You see them working in textile mills. You see them in bakeries. They're everywhere, and that's not an exaggeration. So it's kind of, I guess my point is when I'm doing this research is you can't really find an aspect of the colonial past where people of African descent aren't there, that aren't influential. What happens over time is that those enslaved populations become free. And we can talk about that and how that happens. What's crucial, though, to understand is that if this stuff is happening between 1520 and 1700, okay, more or less, after 1700, I'd say a good 90% of the Black population of Mexico is free. It's mostly the history of free families, right? So that process happens early.
Yeah, now let me get this right. You jamming. They get there to be indentured servants to, let me ask you this. What's the difference in the dynamic of slavery in Mexico than slavery in America?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think it's two main things. One is there's still native people in Mexico, right? There's still the descendants of the Mexica, of the Maya, they're still there. So there's a lot of interaction between Black people and native people. And what happens then is that you have a lot of mixed families, right? Native Black families that come together. This is really important for us to understand because in Spanish law, Native women, indigenous women were free people, okay? So what happens? You have a man from Angola marries a woman from Central Mexico, and their children by law have to be free people. They cannot be enslaved people, right? They're discriminated, they're exploited, but they cannot be enslaved people. And so what that means is that over generations, you have a very, very, very large population of indigenous and African descent that's free.
What are they called? Is there a name for them?
Sometimes they call them, sometimes they use the term mulatto. Sometimes they use the term sambaigo. In truth, what's going to happen is that once they become free and prominent people, they're going to stop labeling them. Okay, so this thing that we have in the States where there's a constant labeling of a person based on their skin color, by 1700, a lot of these people, we can't find the racial label to go along with them. You have to go 3 generations back to figure out who their ancestors are. but they're influential and they're free. And the reason that we know a lot of this is because there were these military companies, okay? These are called milicias. And some of these milicias are for dark-skinned people, milicias de morenos, so they're specific, they're segregated. And others are milicias de pardos. Those are light-skinned people.
Let me stop you there. When you that term you just used, what is that? Is militia the one you just used? Is that military or that's something else? What is that? What is that term?
So the Spaniards never had a standing army in the Americas. They had these groups of military volunteer militias, right? But they kept them segregated. So you had your Spanish militia, you had your Moreno militia, and you had your Pardo militia. So there's amazing historic, like for instance, Dr. Ben Vincent, who I hope you speak to one of these days, has this whole book about these Black military families that essentially their job was to protect a port, a given town from an outsider's attacks, right? Pirates come through, you call your Moreno militia. So all these people, to be in these militias, you have to be a free person. And so a lot of the research we've done lately is to figure out how these free families came together, who they interacted with, where they lived, because we know that an uncle was a general or the cousin was a lieutenant or a sergeant. So it goes really deep and you start to realize, man, this isn't like anecdotal to Mexican history. This is central to Mexican history. So one of the things that I'm going to try to convince you and your viewers of is that it is increasingly difficult to separate Mexican history from Black history. It's very intertwined.
Okay, let me ask you this then. Growing up, going back to your growing up, did you hear any of these stories? Is this a part of your now I ain't gotta call it Black history, but just history that this happened, and that happened?
No, not at all. I mean, so this is what I know from when I went to, for instance, when I went to grade school, elementary school in Mexico. For the most part, we don't get educated on the colonial period, right? It goes a little bit like this. First, there were Mexica populations, native populations. Then the Spaniards came in 1519. And then independence. And so they skipped 3 centuries, right? The 3 centuries when Africans are most visible, most important, I would argue, in Mexican history, right? When there are very large numbers, very large Black communities. So your average Mexican student could have gone to the best school, right? Could have had the best books, doesn't know about the African presence in Mexico because we don't teach the colonial period.
Are they embarrassed by how that to teach it? Why is that something that they don't want people to know?
I think it's 2 things. I think there's a national, so in Mexico, what's really different about the education system in Mexico is that it's federal, right? There's one narrative for what happens and everybody gets it, okay? So when you're doing that, you sell this history of the nation, a unified people, we were here and now we went there, things are better, right? When you teach colonial history, that gets messy. That gets really messy because you start to realize, oh, there's class differences. Oh, there's racial differences.
Oh, I got you.
And that, I mean, you can think about like the debates that we have in the States about like, oh, this state teaches slavery. This state doesn't teach slavery.
Yes.
This state, right? So in Mexico, there's one standard line, and the standard line is, we just don't talk about it because it doesn't advance us politically. Black history, writing Black history into a national curriculum, that's a radical proposal because it means talking about very different experiences that are evident today, right? It's not an equal history, it's an unequal history. So when we talk about the colonial period, when we talk about Afro-Mexicans, it changes that narrative. It really challenges that narrative.
When you mentioned earlier about that guy who was the first Black president, is he identified as a Black president, or is he identified as a person that of some other term? You follow me?
Yeah, it's changing. So now more and more, so I was in Mexico 3 weeks ago. And now when I'm in Mexico and I run into a statue of Vicente Guerrero, more and more I'll see like, oh, Presidente Negro, right? Like the Black president, the Afro-Mexican president. I would say that 20 years ago, we didn't know that. When I was taught the history of Vicente Guerrero, yeah, he's an independence hero, But that was it. He was an independence hero. Now we're willing to say, yeah, but you know what? He came from a position of power because he had the support of these Black communities in Guerrero and Michoacan, right? So like, we're starting to reframe what these things mean for the 21st century. It's really cool that it's happening right now, I have to say. It's exciting.
Is there, so for him to be, to become the president, is there racism with, let's say, the Spaniard community or whoever that doesn't like him because he is of African descent and they wouldn't have voted for him? You know what I mean? And that kind of racial tensions?
No, absolutely. Because think about it. You've got a colonial system that for 3 centuries, right? For 300 years says, if you're going to be a physician, if you're going to be a lawyer, if you're going to be whatever, you have to be white, right? So if you get 300 years of that, then how are you going to react to a political leader that's Black, right? So of course, he's discriminated extensively during his life. When he goes up to debate, people in Congress call him El Negro Vicente Guerrero, but they mean it in a pejorative way. They don't mean it in a, oh, we're proud that he's Black. They mean it like, he's Black, how could he be president, right? So a lot of these figures come around in the years of independence, precisely because the system is getting unseated. We have new people coming into power. So he's one that's very, very prominent. The other one, Morelos, is like, as I said before, he's like one of the true fathers of the Mexican state. And he also comes from a mixed background. He was a muleteer, right? So his job was to carry loads of, I don't know, corn and maize and things that you would have to transport from town A to town B. It was a humble profession, right? And he was also a priest. So you have these men who are very skilled. They know the countryside. They know where the Black towns now are. They know where they're going to have support. And of course, they've started to figure out ways of connecting with people that the Spanish elites couldn't. And so that's what's happening in the 1810s, 1820s.
Is there something that the government tried to do to stop those people from voting?
Well, so 1810, there's no voting in Mexico, right? It's still a colony. It's still supposed to pay tribute to the Spanish king. They're the ones, especially Morelos, who's starting to develop these ideas about representation, right? If we're an independent nation, who gets to vote? Who represents us? And one of the things that's crucial about Morelos is he says, we have to do away with these horrible terms that have always discriminated us, right? So he's against labeling people. Grandmother's negra, your grandfather's mulatto. His big phrase is, we should abolish these horrible caste categories, and one American will only be distinguished by another by vice or virtue. So he's thinking about things that we hear later on in the 1960s, but he's thinking about this in 1810, right? So those are the kind of things that he's dealing with. Now, it gets murky, right? Because some things that Morelos was thinking about wouldn't vibe with us today. Like what Morelos was a Catholic priest. And so he had a real belief in Mexico should only be Catholic. Nobody else should be allowed to be in Mexico. Well, we don't vibe with that anymore, right? But this idea of not discriminating people by their racial ancestry, he was a leading thinker of that in 1810, 1813.
Let's go back to the guy again. I can't speak the Spanish in the dialect like you do, but who was the president? When they showed his picture, he looked like a Black guy, though, I'm sure.
Yeah. And what you can do is, there's all sorts of portraits of Guerrero, right? Of Vicente. And you can see the ones where like he's a little whitewashed, right?
Really?
Like, certain features are different, the hair is different. And then you see the ones that are a little more authentic and you go, wait, that is a dark-skinned man. And then you see some portraits where you go, that's a Black man, right? And so it's one of these things about who did that portrait, when did they do that portrait, why? So if I were to see a portrait of Guerrero today, done by an artist right now in 2022, I'd probably see a Black man being represented. If you go back 100 years ago, you're probably going to see a very white representation of Guerrero. But more and more, we know him as Mexico's Black president. And it's important to say it, right? It's important to say Mexico had a Black president in the 19th century. It is important to know that.
When you're using the term Black, is that the term that they call them, Black? I know you use other terms, but is that still?
So there are many. So what happens is, early in the colonial period, when you have a lot of people from Angola and Congo being brought through, they're universally described as Black, right? And the word is negro. Negro just means Black, skin color, right? As these mixtures start to take place, you start to see different kind of skin colors and different textures.
Yeah,
sure. So you start to see terms like mulatto, which is a little disrespectful in the period. So free people start saying, I'm not mulatto, I'm pardo, I'm parda. And what that meant basically is, I'm a free person of African descent, right? So when you see someone being addressed respectfully, they say, Antonio Brogdon Pardo, right? Because they're labeling him as this kind of person, but a free person. And if someone was trying to maybe slight someone, they might say, Antonio Brogdon Mulatto, knowing that would probably offend the person.
I
right?
got you.
But it really varies by, where you were in society, where you lived. Did you live in the port? Did you live in a city in the mountains? Like, what was your everyday reality? Those kind of things really affected it.
When you talked about them as initially when in that enslavement, indentured servant component, was there slave revolts, rebellions is the word I want to use.
Oh yeah. We had so actually this is I'm writing a book on this right now.
Okay, so, yeah, we're gonna get on that right there.
No, we will. So what I would say is, anytime you have enslavement of Africans, you have rebellion. It's you can't have one without the other. So for instance, some of the first records that we have, 1537, there's a full-scale uprising in Mexico City and in the silver mines of Amatepec, right? You would think, oh, well, maybe the Spaniards are having second thoughts about this. Maybe they'll back off from enslaving people. They don't. So they keep bringing enslaved people in. And so the revolts continue. So we have revolts in 1545. We have revolts in 1612. We have revolts in any time. So that's something that's really important for us to understand, that it's not just people being imposed, right, with these unfreedoms. It's that there's always a reaction to that. Mexico's famous because there's a community called Llanga today. Llanga is in the mountains. If you go from the port of Veracruz and you go up about 60 miles inland, there's this town called Llanga. Llanga is named after a Maroon, an African man from the Bran Nation, West Africa, who creates a free community and defends that free community for 2-3 generations. It gets to the point that the Spaniards can't deal with this anymore, and they would rather have a peace treaty with Llanga than to continue fighting him. And so that town becomes officially recognized as a free Black community, but not because the Spaniards were generous, it's because they could not defeat these Maroons.
Oh, okay.
So next week, actually, in August, there's going to be a Festival de Llanga, right? So this name means something in Mexico. He's one of the first, we could argue, one of the first freedom fighters.
Oh, yeah.
In the Western Hemisphere.
Okay.
And he wins it for him and his community.
Now, when you say a festival, it's a festival of when he won or when he was born, or what does that celebrate?
So what these festivals are trying to do in Mexico now is to celebrate Afro-Mexican heritage and culture. So a lot of it is food driven, right? Like, are you going to make particular kind of dishes like tamales jarochos, right? We have your standard tamales, and then you have these tamales that have plantain leaves and use seafood and different kinds of combinations that you don't see in the traditional Mexican diet. So there's that. Then you've got forms that are associated with Black populations, like son jarocho. The son jarocho is it's a percussion-driven music that's accompanied by dancing. It's rhythmic, and you do it on this wooden platform, and it's famous from that region in Veracruz, right? So these festivals are trying to bring these practices up again, to celebrate them again, and to say, this is Afro-Mexican culture. This is what we celebrate when we think about Llanga.
Is there a date that slavery ended, and that they might, you know, how we say 16, you know, Juneteenth and that kind of thing? Is there a date like that there?
There is. So the big date is 1829, which is when Guerrero abolishes slavery entirely. So Mexico's already an independent nation, but there's still slave populations. There isn't, I can't say in good faith that everyone knows that September 15th, 1829, that's a day. No, because Guerrero did something really interesting. He said, oh, 1829, September 15th, that's Mexican Independence Day. That's the day that I'm going to abolish slavery. So he was going for something symbolic. The date 1829, though, has to matter to us, because we have to think about what that means when we compare it to other places, right? So like in Brazil, slavery ends in 1888. It's almost the 20th century. In the US, we know when we have the Emancipation Proclamation. This is a good 2 generations before, right? Yeah. You have a statement, not just by a president, but by a Black president saying, we can't do this. Slavery is done. And that's where Guerrero is celebrated a lot. We can think about Guerrero in the context of the Haitian Revolution, right? We can say in 1804, Jean-Jacques Dessalines on January 1st says, there will never be slavery in Haiti again. Well, Guerrero's doing this 25 years later. It's important to see these continuities, right? These connections, and how Haitian people, Mexican people, American people, Brazilian people are connected through their Black history. But 1829, that's the crucial date.
Is that so? And then what happens is, like, again, all I'm doing is comparing it to America. Was it a smooth transition? Were there did they have, you know, like we had in America, the Reconstruction period, and then we had, after that, you know, worked for about 7 years. Then they came through Jim Crow. Is that comparable type scenario?
No, it's not really comparable, because the key thing is, and this is really important to understand, is that by 1700, most Black people in Mexico are free people. So there was an enslaved population, but it was very, very small.
Okay.
In 1829. So what you have really is people saying, like, yeah, we've been free. we've been acting free for generations. This just makes it official, right? This makes it legal. I would say that it's more like a celebratory gesture. But if you're going to think about it in relation to the US, what we need to understand is that Guerrero also knew what was happening in Texas, right? Guerrero knows that cotton slavery is expanding really aggressively in Texas in the 1820s, and in the 1830s and 40s. That thing is going to really explode. And so he knows that it's important to say slavery ends here, because we don't want that cotton slavery coming into Mexico.
I
right?
got you.
So it was strategic. He was really intelligent about this.
I've had people on the show who talk about Black fighters going into Mexico, and I'm going up the timeline, probably a whole lot, I don't know, to fight for independence, for America to be separate from Mexico and all that kind of thing. You follow me on this question?
Yeah, so I would say this. I would say that if you think about Texas, Louisiana, Georgia, South Carolina, those places that are closer to what is today Mexico, there have always been Black people traveling those borders, right? Sometimes for freedom, right? Sometimes to say, in the English colonies, I'm an enslaved person, but if I make it to Spanish Florida, I can claim to be a Catholic, I can be free, right?
Right.
And Professor Landers talked about that
Right.
on your show. That also happens in Mexico, right? So you have, for instance, in the 19th century, you have a lot of free men of color, especially escaping Louisiana, escaping New Orleans, and coming into Mexican ports and saying, I want to be a free person. I'll do anything. Make sure that I'm a free person. And sometimes it works. Like actually, if you know, there's this port, Tampico, right? There's Veracruz, there's Campeche. Those ports have really interesting ties to New Orleans because you had free Black men who were enslaved in Louisiana and claimed freedom in Mexico. Now, on the fighting part, that's where it gets murky, right? Like, whose army? Like, were you fighting for the French, for the Spanish, for the U.S. Army? Like, how does that work? That comes down to a case-by-case basis.
Oh,
But if we
really?
think about what we were saying before, right? That there are these Black and brown militias in Mexico already, you can imagine that those Black and brown militias sometimes get sent to the north. So they're active in the Louisiana region, around Galveston, right? They're active in those places that we don't have a really good grasp of until later on. And this is tough, right? Like understanding this history of the US-Mexico border and what it means for Black people is tricky because on the one hand, we get taught national histories, right? We get taught the history of the US, we get taught the history of Mexico, but what does it mean for them to go back and forth or just to escape from an unfree place to a free place? There's a lot of good new research being done on this. These connections to the free Black communities of northern Mexico, right? With the Black Seminoles, for instance.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I'm going to use that term. Yeah, right.
And this is, I think, where there's a lot of interest to figure out where we have these common points, where we can say, well, you know, I have this passport, you have that passport, but in 1750, our families were dealing with some of the same things. That's really interesting.
Did Mexico keep good records so that you can do your research kind of easily, that type thing?
Yeah. So in my case, yes. One of the big things is that the Catholic Church was obsessed with recording a lot of information, right? And so anytime that someone was born and they were baptized, they made a record of that. Now, in the Catholic Church, African people could marry, right? Like they were allowed to go into church and have that union validated, and people had to respect that. It didn't matter if they were enslaved or not. So we have a lot of records on those marriages. So I can go back and tell you about, for instance, what's a good family? The Pardave family in Puebla. And I can tell you about their history back to the 1640s, 1650s, because I know what happened to their grandsons and I know what happened to their godsons, right? So those records are really good. Where it's tough is like in the ports, like this book that I'm writing now in Veracruz. Ports have a lot of humidity, they get attacked. And so sometimes those records go away. But if you talk about mainland populations, very good records to reconstruct Black history.
Are there records of when we talk about the enslavement in Africa, I mean in Mexico, is it trading like it is here in America? How about that? You know what I mean? Where I'm gonna sell you somewhere and that kind of thing. Is it similar in that regard?
Yes. And so those kind of records are different. We call those notarial records in Mexico. And we can see, for instance, I have cases of Angolan boys, right, being sold in a city. They're given a name that isn't their name, right? They're called Pedro, Juan, Felipe. Those aren't their native names, and they're branded, and then that comes up in a document, in a bill of sale, and then years later, I'll see in the record that so and so was sold to this other person, to this other household. So if those young men stayed in one city, I can track their history. and I can start to figure out, what happened to them. Did they form part of this community, that community? What's really hard and where we lose track of people is when they get sold to a different town, to a different state. And then it's really hard to reconstitute those histories. Yeah. I know that there are genealogists that do this, right? They go on ancestry.com, they go on these websites, and they're able to piece it together. But that's very, very difficult to do. People who stay in one city, whether enslaved or free, we can reconstruct their histories. We just need a last name. So I would invite your viewers, if they think they have some Mexican ancestry, they can always shoot me an email and say, hey, I think I might be related to this person. I can try and track them down if they have a location, especially. That's usually the crucial piece of information. Which parish do I look them up into?
Is there somebody from Mexico who came to America and made changes in American way of life of some sort? I don't know what that might be. Telling people over here in America what happened back in Mexico, and now we want to help Mexican Black people here. Like Marcus Garvey goes out and says, hey man, I know there's some Black people that's getting mistreated. Let me go see what we can do to help them. Is there any of that type of scenario?
That is a really tough question, Anthony. Okay. What I would say is that right now, there are Black political parties being formed. There are Black community groups being formed. And the thing is, language is an issue, right? So if you have folks that can read, write, or speak Spanish, they're linking up with Black organizations in the States, but also like in Cuba and in Colombia. So one person that comes to mind is Sergio Penalosa, where he's been a community leader in a region called Costa Chica. It's on the Pacific coast. And they're saying, hey, we've got low levels of access to clean water, low levels of access to quality education. We're starting to see that this is very similar to the case in Arkansas. It's very similar to the case in Charleston, right? And so those kind of connections are starting to happen now. So if people are interested, there are collectives that they can join, especially online now, right? A lot of this is happening like on Facebook, on YouTube. So this organizing, this new consciousness is happening in the present. So that's what I would say to that question. In terms of historical actors, I have a harder time telling you this person did this in 1928 and had this effect on the US. I think that's a little tricky. Where the new research is happening though is figuring out how prominent African Americans experienced Mexico. Like, what does it mean that Langston Hughes had such a deep knowledge of Mexican society? That's really interesting.
Okay, yeah, that's a good one too. Yeah, right.
Like so when Hughes goes to Mexico, late teens, early 20s, and he's teaching at a private school, and he's in the middle of like these very close-knit Mexican communities, what do those experiences do to him when he goes back and forms part of the Harlem Renaissance, right? So like we can start to think about individuals who came and went, and they were really leading some really interesting cultural exchanges. There's a great new book called Finding Afro-Mexico, which is about that, which is about musical exchange, artists, muralists traveling back and forth, how they influenced one another. That's where this new research is happening right now on the 20th century.
Oh yeah, that's so. And I guess I don't know if this is the same question, but there is not other than escaping slavery to get to Mexico. Did slaves in Mexico come to America? No, because slavery was going on, so maybe not. Yeah.
Right. So I think if you think that in the 1600s, that's when slavery is most intense in Mexico, there's not a lot happening in terms of the British colonies, right? Like they're starting. So a good example I have, for instance, is Charleston, right? Charleston,
Right.
South Carolina.
Right.
Is established 1670. Well, by 1670, most of the people that I study in Puebla are free people. So they're not gonna be running
Right.
Charleston because
Right.
there's no freedom in Charleston for them, right? So that's where it kind of misses. What I would say though is that you have free people of African descent that come into the States and established really important cities. And the most prominent example is the city of Los Angeles. Los Angeles, California is established by Indian people, Mestizo people, and Black people who come up from Mexico and are sent to settle that space, right? So when you think of it like that, you go, wow, like how connected are we that LA is part of this Black Mexican history, right? It's the movement of free people, free Black people that defines that space. But we've never been taught to think of it like that.
When we talk about, we're almost coming to a close. When we talk about Black people fighting, did Black people, were they allowed to fight? And you said militias, maybe, were they allowed to fight that helped Mexico get its independence?
Yes, they were allowed to fight for Mexican independence, but, and this is a big but, a lot of them decided to fight for Spain, and there's a good reason for that, right?
Hold on, let me stop you. When you say fight for Spain, that means you're not getting your independence.
Right, and I'll tell you why. This is really interesting. A lot of our independence movements in Latin America are led by very conservative, rich white elites who weren't necessarily the most egalitarian people. And so a lot of these soldiers had to make a decision. Is it better for me to fight for a Spanish king that at least allows me to have a military rank, a uniform, certain tax privileges? Or should I fight for this rich guy who's always oppressed my family for generations, right? So the Black and the brown militias have to make really difficult decisions about who they're going to back and who they won't back. And in some cases, we see that they actually defend Spain, and they defend Spain well. And that's where it gets down into that nitty gritty about like, who was running the independence movement, right? Like, is independence if it's run by your oppressors? Maybe it's not. And that's where it gets messy. I love that part, but that's a really, really messy part to the independence histories of Latin America.
Do you have a copy of your book that you can show us?
I do. So this
we want to see it. We want to plug. Yeah, we plug it.
Let me take the blur. Can I take the blur up?
Yeah.
Here.
Yeah, I see it. Yeah, there it is.
Okay, so this is called Urban Slavery in Colonial Mexico. It's a paperback now, came out in 2018. And this is that deep, deep history, right? Of what was it like for Africans and their descendants in Central Mexico. I have a new book that should be out next year called Mexico, Slavery and Freedom. And that's gonna be a documentary history. So it's gonna be primary sources, so you can read them and you can go, oh, okay, that's what Guerrero was doing. That should be out by the end of the year next year, 2023.
Well, from what I gather, what you are doing in your research in these books is cutting edge. There's nothing else out there that has documented like what you're documenting. And so maybe those who have conscious attitudes in Mexico will embrace what you've done, where some others may not. Is that the case?
That is the case. Look, I would rather have a controversial presentation. I would rather have some people bothered by the things I've said than have no effect at all. So some people are inspired by this and they go, oh my gosh, I just realized half my family is Black, right? That's happening right now. And then I would say that there's another part of the population that goes, nope, that's not me. I wasn't taught that. I know nothing about this African diaspora stuff that you're talking about. So I'm okay with that. I'm okay leaning into that and saying we have these legacies that we can choose not to talk about, but I'm going to talk about them. And so far it's working. I have to say, I think there's a lot of interest in Mexico and in the States about learning about these shared histories, whether I'm talking about this in South Carolina or New York or in California, there's real interest, right? And so what I would like to say is to thank you for this opportunity to share this work.
Sure.
Because we have a lot to talk about, Anthony. And
I got you.
we can't do it. We can't do it if we don't talk about it. So
I got you.
So thank you. So thank you for this opportunity.
Let me ask you this. Like another question just came on. So would the pinnacle of your, and maybe not the highest pinnacle, but one of the pinnacles is, let's say that the schools in Mexico adopt your book to teach what you talk about, where they have never talked about it before.
Yeah, that would be fantastic, and it's starting to happen. It's starting to happen. We're starting to see these little readers, right? Like these $5 books that are starting to circulate at newspaper stands, and kids have them, and they're learning about Black history, and it's happening now. It's just, it took 2 centuries. It took 3 centuries. So that would be fundamental for the Mexican side of the equation. In the US, what I would love to see is for us to break away from this binary that sometimes we study history in. We're always talking about Black history in relation to white history, but there's this whole other dimension to it, which is, what do you do with like these Latino populations, right? We have a lot of interaction with one another. And so I'd love to break that field open and have each other talk about, what does freedom mean for your family? What does that mean? What does it mean to claim, to know your ancestors? I think we have a lot of points in common.
Okay.
And we can do better there.
I got another one. So you're not rocking the boat so much that you have to fear for your safety, though. Over in Mexico, like when you go to Mexico, there is there, like the reason why I'm asking that, how America is going now, and these militias and this critical race theory, and somebody might get so mad when somebody's talking about it. That's not something you have to think about.
No, that's not happening. I've been fortunate, but in general, I would say that's not something that we're that hold up on, right? Like, most Mexican people, and I'm going to generalize here, most Mexican people are brown people. Most of us are mixed, and so for a long time we've been told we're Native and we're Spaniard, but a lot of us know that there's something else, and so like there's a willingness to hear that out, right? There's a willingness to say, I'm this, I'm that, but I'm also a person of African descent. That's been really, really transformative. Or say, what, my whole lineage is from Spain. I'm not buying this. Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, I love it. How do people get your book, and do you have a website? Plug as much as you can, please.
Sure. So you can find my book on Amazon, on Abe Books, on Cambridge, the Cambridge site. But if you just search urban slavery in Colonial Mexico, you will find my book. It's a paperback. You can get it. I think it's 25% off right now.
Yeah.
You can get it, and if you just want to Google me, you can write Pablo Sierra, and you can write Rochester, or you can write Afro-Mexicans, and you can Google me. I'm findable.
I got another one. How did you come to this conclusion that this would be your mission, to tell this story?
I never sought out to do this. I'd always been interested in Black history, but I did not know how deep that history went in Mexico. It all happened because I was in my hometown and I thought I'd stop by this archive, and I asked for 1 box of documents. And as soon as I pulled out those documents, it was all documents on young Angolan boys. And that happened in 2007, I'm sorry. And right there, I was like, there's a very, very deep history to talk about here, and let's just do it. So yeah, it's kind of become my life's work. I never thought that this is what I would be doing, right? Like I'm gonna work on Afro-Mexican history for my livelihood. I never thought of doing that, but it's there. I'd like to think that it found me. And so I'm just very fortunate to be able to share this, and hopefully to have some impact on, especially on young people, and how they think about themselves and their communities.
You have to be a good guy, a conscious guy, to want to turn over this rock, let's say. Your parents know you doing this and that kind of thing?
Oh yeah. And it's interesting because I think we're having more conversations now about, the Veracruz side of the family, and we should reach out to that side of the family, and we should be a little more empathetic. And so I think it's happening now. Look, there are tours. There are now Black Mexico legacy tours, heritage tours that you can
really
do. Yeah. And so if I'm sure that many of your viewers have that interest, they can search that out, and they'll take them to these Black communities and to the festivals, and they'll do these tours that are really important. So I would invite them.
On that note, what would I Google to say, let me find out one of these tours? What city might that take me to? That kind of thing.
I think for sure they're going to Veracruz on the Gulf Coast. That's kind of where it begins in Mexico. And then I'm sure that they take you to some of the old, what would have been like the old sugar plantations. But now more and more the black towns, the pueblos negros, they're on the Pacific coast. So I would imagine you would take a bus to the other side. There's beautiful beaches, stunning beaches. So it's a stunning place. Yeah. But also then you get to see the Black dances, right? And Anita Gonzalez is a dance scholar who you should speak to. And she has a book called Dancing Afro-Mexico. And so you can see about that. You can see that African heritage in motion in those dances, in her research and in these communities. So I think that's how they would do it.
Yeah, because I must admit, when I think of Mexico, and I've been to Acapulco and I've been to Cancun, and there's a couple of resort islands. Shucks, I can't think of them offhand, but I've been to those two cities, but I didn't know of anything outside that other than Mexico City.
If you go to Acapulco and you drive an hour north, you're in the heart of that Black community.
Oh, really?
Yes, sir. That is where the Costa Chica is, and that's where this consciousness movement is the strongest right now.
Oh, really? I love it. Well, hey, I thank you so very much for coming on stage, man. Everybody, if you didn't learn nothing today, I don't know. You knew all this. Congratulations. If you knew, this is what I do with Strong Inspiration. I find these people who have lived it, who are experts, who studied, researched it, and all that other stuff, and allow them to, give it to you. This is phenomenal. And I got I don't know, I use this term every now and then, sparsely, kind of an icon in the making. An icon in the making. Because as that book splurges and other people begin to think it, he is the one who really started it all on Strong Inspiration. So come on, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button. If there was a love button, you would have to hit that one. But hit the like button, hit the notifications bell, tell somebody about Strong Inspirations. Don't keep it to yourself. We're going across the globe. Black folks who have been all over the world in some form or fashion. And they're in Mexico, which I did not know, had not thought of it. And now I'm even more inspired by hearing this story, as you all my guests. Is there a way to, in the native language, say bye-bye or some motto or something like that that can close us out?
You can say gracias and adios.
That's easy enough. I heard those words before. That's easy enough. I like it. Thank you for coming on. We're gonna talk offline. You know we are. I appreciate you, everybody. Bye bye. We out.